It's my absolute pleasure to be here to introduce our speakers. I'm going to go ahead and read from y'all's bios. So Dr. Nora Kenworthy is Professor of Nursing and Health Studies at the University of Washington, Bothell. She is also adjunct and faculty in the Departments of Global Health and Anthropology at UW Seattle. Broadly speaking, her work examines how politics, technology, and inequality affect health. She is the author of the book that we're going to learn about today, or hear about, Crowded Out, The True Costs of Crowdfunding Healthcare. And it has also won awards for another book, Ethnography, entitled Mistreated, the Political Consequences of the Fight Against AIDS in Lesotho. Lesotho. Okay, I'm glad that I checked it. And Dr. Kenworthy received her PhD in social medical sciences from Columbia University. And then we have two discussants today for our Author Meets Critic. Anjum Hajat is an associate professor in the Department of Epidemiology here at the University of Washington. Her research seeks to understand how social and environmental determinants of health contribute to poor health and health disparities. And specifically, her environmental health research has examined environmental injustice and health disparities caused by environmental factors. In terms of social factors, she has a large body of work around health impacts and precarious employment and other forms of social inequality. And she strives to engage with communities most impacted by injustice and disparities while also asking questions to guide policy and action. So welcome. And our other discussant is Dr. Amy Hagopian, who is Professor Emeritus at the University of Washington in Public Health. And she conducts academic work on how the maldistribution of power and wealth undermines health. She taught a class on war and health for 9 years at UW and led a team to measure war-related mortality in Iraq in 2011. She's currently involved in research projects to improve methods to count the number of people living homeless, deprived of human rights to housing. She has taught a class on homelessness with an emphasis on causes and consequences of living in health. She serves as chair of the editorial board of the American Journal of Public Health and received the APHA's Seidel-Levy Award for Peace in 2018. And she's incoming chair of the APHA's International Health Section, active in APHA's Peace Caucus on homelessness, and a leader in the Global Alliance on War, Conflict, and Health. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming our speakers.
Okay, I have to apologize. I accidentally clicked the update instead of the not now. So we were trying to switch over to a different computer. Okay.
While they're doing that, I will encourage you, if you have a punch card, you are a student who's partaking in Jeffrey's 501 class, you can get credit for being here by getting a card punched. Later, your name will be put into a raffle, and you could potentially win excellent prizes. Thank you.
All right, I think we figured it out. So I want to first just start by thanking CSDE for hosting this conversation and just for being such a wonderful source of support in many forms for this work over the years. And in particular, my gratitude to Ron and Jessica for organizing this panel at a very busy time of the year. And then thanks also to Anjum and Amy for being willing to engage with this book, and whose work and expertise had shaped this project long before it was ever conceived in book form. So I'm grateful to you both as colleagues. Our plan is that I will talk very briefly about some of the broad contours of the book and what motivated its writing. And then I'll turn it over to Anjum and Amy for comments and questions and connections to their own work. And then we'll turn it over to you for questions and comments. So like all, I think, good book projects, this one started as a sort of puzzle that I couldn't figure out and a problem that I couldn't quite get out of my head. This is what crowdfunding campaigns often look like when I started finding them on the internet and also on street corners around 2013, 2014. And it was clear even then that many, many Americans who were turning to new platforms like GoFundMe, thank you, were turning to those platforms in order to address urgent medical and healthcare needs. And that has continued to be the most common use of these platforms in the intervening years. So I became really fascinated by what this sort of reflected about our healthcare system and its gaps, but also more, and perhaps more importantly, I became interested in understanding how crowdfunding might be changing the ways that Americans were thinking about care, about digital forms of charity, and who becomes deserving of collective help in our contemporary systems. It's hard to overstate how quickly crowdfunding platforms really overtook a substantial sector of American giving. So by 2019, a national survey showed that more than a quarter of Americans had either started or given to a crowdfunding campaign specifically for medical causes or needs. GoFundMe became an eponym for sort of what we do in crisis. And so one of the most common things that happens to people when they get sick or face a disaster like the ones we've been seeing in the news this week is sort of response of like, you should start a GoFundMe. And it was also becoming clear that this phenomenon reflected gaping holes in our social safety nets, and that many crowdfunders were not necessarily turning to this like very large anonymous online crowd, but largely to people in their own social networks who looked like them and shared a lot of their own vulnerabilities. And so a lot of times those who are donating to crowdfunding campaigns are those who are also low income, underinsured, and unemployed. And so while news feeds tend to be full of stories of enormous crowdfunding success, everyday campaigns like the ones that I was studying were reflecting what Nancy Fraser has come to call a crisis of care and late liberalism. So what I and other researchers found as we looked into this phenomenon is that crowdfunding is not necessarily the sort of strangers helping strangers success story that we tend to think of it as. And instead that we were kind of consistently documenting things like 90% of campaigns do not reach their financial goals, 30 to 40% of campaigns seem to get no donations whatsoever, and that racial, gender, socioeconomic, and class disparities are all sort of rampant and oftentimes amplified through these platforms. So this so-called marketplace for, as its organizers and CEOs call it, democratizing charity, has actually become one where a lot of disparities become amplified and also normalized. So taken together, I think the research demonstrated that crowdfunding was actually exacerbating and worsening the very social inequities and health system gaps that were driving people to these platforms in the first place. And then secondly, as these inequities became normalized, I was finding in conversations with crowdfunders that it was sort of powerfully lowering the expectations of vulnerable people as to what they deserved. At the same time that people who were using crowdfunding from positions of privilege were starting to assume that they were more deserving of help precisely because their campaigns had been successful. So I became pretty convinced that crowdfunding was changing how people think about rights and entitlements and deservingness and care within our health and political systems. And I was having lots of conversations in my research with people who were expressing a kind of implicit sense of like, something being very wrong here. You know, like, yes, it's heartwarming that a kid with terminal cancer can get some help, but like, also, is this really what we're reduced to? And is this how we're gonna make choices about who deserves help in our society? And so I really started writing this book, not as a traditional academic book at all, but as a book to try to translate academic work on this topic for broader audiences and try and give people a bit of a vocabulary for naming and understanding that implicit discomfort. And so methodologically, here we go. Methodologically, the book really highlights data from both quantitative studies that we did over about a 10-year time period, but then also it really focuses on the sort of qualitative and ethnographic stories from interviews that I've conducted over many years, mostly focused on the US, but not exclusively. And this work involved interviews with crowdfunders, with their family members and caretakers, with industry experts, as well as digital ethnographies of platforms and thousands of individual campaigns. And then finally, focus groups across the US with people who had donated to medical campaigns. So my hope is that the book can offer people a bit of a kind of concept vocabulary for what's going on here. And one of the ways that I do that is focusing on the idea of toxicities. So I build on the work of oncologists and health economists who have identified the idea of financial toxicity in illness, and that is the ways that financial burdens of illness can worsen health outcomes and healthcare outcomes. But what I add to that is what I call a set of moral toxicities that I think describe the types of entrenched social mores that crowdfunding is sort of feeding on and fueling, and that ultimately are undermining some of our efforts to build more equitable and just health systems. And so that includes things like ideas about the deserving poor, about sort of rugged individualism, market supremacy and competition, and also sort of downstream technological solutionism. And so each of the chapters of the book kind of explores one of these moral toxicities and kind of demonstrates how it's linked to both crowdfunding as well as the ways that our health system has been constructed and exacerbates health inequities. And then finally, the last chapter of the book tries to offer 3 templates for action. And the first template is one that we might most commonly encounter within the tech field itself, and that's kind of the realm of sort of tweaks and fixes, right? And scholars like Ruha Benjamin have explained in really beautiful ways why these may be attractive, but insufficient for addressing the harms of tech platforms, and sometimes how the tweaks and fixes themselves can amplify those very harms. The second template that I offer is one that aims to make crowdfunding, at least in the ways that it is commonly used today, much less common and less ubiquitous. And that involves much more extensive efforts of what I call repair and remaking. These are larger projects that aim to change the structural systems of market-based health and charity, and to create the kinds of moral and financial templates for a healthier and more just future. These are very large and necessary projects, but they're also daunting and lengthy and very resource intensive. And so as a final template for action, I sort of examine, like, what does it mean to live in the meanwhile, and how are people in communities doing that work? And so to do this, I sort of explore the work of mutual aid groups and others who are organizing collective care amidst and within broader struggles for health justice. And I think these groups remind us that how we do our work of care matters, not just in the now and in the meanwhile, but in the long term, what kinds of futures it builds towards, and what sorts of moral frameworks it strengthens in terms of envisioning and building towards more just and universal health systems. So I'm gonna stop there and turn it over to, I think, Amy first. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nora, for writing this amazing book and bringing it to us. I think I'm going first because of some silliness about alphabetic order. Let me just say, one of the things I loved about this book was the poetry. Nora does this amazing thing of pulling out phrases from GoFundMe campaigns and creating a piece of poetry at the end of each chapter based on these awful, heartbreaking phrases and statements, and I found that very moving, actually. I also loved how real the book is, sort of assembling these stories that she collected by actually listening to people struggling through the horrific mess that America's health system is. I talked to somebody on a Zoom meeting the other day who had just had a foot amputated for diabetes, and she says she has a different doctor for her left foot and her right foot. I thought, yeah, that's America. All right, and I like the concept of living in the meanwhile, because again, it's very real and concrete. I'm just going to riff on a few things and say a few things, and you can respond to what you like. So one of the things I've seen on my Instagram feed recently is an exhortation that says the poor are always told to buy fewer lattes, but the rich are never told to buy fewer yachts so that they could actually pay their employees a living wage. And this is, you know, our unit of analysis and focus is always on the needy. You know, when we do, even in academia, when we do our research, it's on what do these people need, and, you know, what are their weaknesses, and what are they able to get and not get. And we rarely study the rich or the policymakers or the people actually making this system and why they choose the choices that they make. So for this occasion, I wore my favorite t-shirt. I think it is time to tax the rich a lot. I'm watching our city council do this ridiculous alternative to the social housing measure that many of us collected signatures to put on the ballot. And, you know, they're just castrating the whole idea of social housing. So follow that issue if you haven't. The rich also find these amazing ways to make money off of their philanthropy and of their generous donations to the poor. They get these amazing tax write-offs. Anybody, so not to change the subject to a different book, but has anybody read Tim Schwab's The Bill Gates Problem? Great book, I really recommend it. You know, talking about how Bill Gates abuses his wealth and privilege to create even more wealth and privilege by masquerading as a philanthropist. And after this, I'm going to go over to the Rosling building that he built for so, you know, the insurance model is supposed to work on protecting us against unpredictable things that can occur. But insurance companies, of course, are realizing that many of these things that occur are perfectly predictable, and they better guard themselves against any losses associated with them. Watch them de-insure people across Florida, right? Mm-hmm. Watch them figure out ways to actually not reimburse health workers or patients for perfectly predictable health problems that occur because they're poor. So Nora talks a bit in the book about mutual aid as kind of an alternative model to the GoFundMe electronic campaigns, where actual real people in communities actually get together and help each other struggle through difficult circumstances like the goddamn pandemic. That there are aspects to mutual aid which we could bring to our communities and help each other out as a strong alternative to that. And, you know, one of the things GoFundMe does, of course, is depoliticize and strip all the drama out of these situations other than personal drama. There's no political drama in any GoFundMe campaign. These campaigns never acknowledge the meanness of neoliberalism. They never work to radicalize people around pushing back on the system or organize the population that is responding here. But there are a couple of sort of GoFundMe adjacent activities that I find very interesting, like the National Bailout Campaign. Anybody follow that? On Mother's Day, they do the Mama's Day Bailout, featuring raising bail money to get Black women out of prison on Mother's Day, which is sort of a very meanwhile activity. But it is mutual aid, and it is sort of GoFundMe in a way. I mean, people mail in money. It's a national campaign, so it's not like there are local meetings of this that you go to and get to know the prisoners who are released and help them in other ways other than money. So it is sort of GoFundMe adjacent, I guess. But a feature of the national bailout campaign is that they actually do the political work of reforming the criminal incarceration system, not the justice system. And the bailout is just one way for the public to get involved in that. Another one, I think, is these campaigns to buy debt. So, debt gets sold in packages that are way below their ticket price. And people go in and buy these packaged medical debts and student loan debts and write them off for people, which is, a heartwarming interpersonal gesture, which is lovely and can make a real difference for people. I think one of the most heartbreaking things we're seeing lately are GoFundMe campaigns for people to get out of Gaza. It's now become extremely expensive to try to get out of Gaza, for various reasons, political reasons, as well as opportunistic reasons on the part of the transport schemes. It's now many thousands of dollars for somebody to try to get out. And getting out alone is rarely something somebody tries. They try to get out with their family members, so it really multiplies the cost. And I don't know how well GoFundMe really is set up to meet that particular need, and nothing else has stepped in to try to deal with it. Of course, there could be a political way of addressing that need, but we operate under a government that is financing a genocidal regime, and that's not going to change no matter how this election comes out. So I do want to point people to this hilarious website or Facebook page called Dystopian Late-Stage Capitalism Horrors Repackaged as Heartwarming Stories. Does anybody follow that page? And sometimes there are featured, so people crowdsource to this page by offering up examples of these horrors masquerading as heartwarming stories. Sometimes they are employer-driven heartwarming stories, like, isn't it great when Walmart sets up food collection stations for their employees? I mean, that's just so sweet of them, right? Because they don't pay their people enough to eat well. So they are asking their customers to help fund feeding their employees. But on the other hand, there are also political activism stories on that page. People step up. Here was one yesterday. Somebody bought out the medical deficit, or the meal deficit pay for Bluffdale Elementary. I don't even know what state that is. But some doctor signed up to buy all the school lunch debt that kids had accrued at this elementary school, because the school is charging for school lunches. And what a country, right? Did anybody see Michael Moore's film, Where Shall We Invade Next? I always think of that film when I think of school lunches, because that movie features great things other countries do that we could do. Why don't we invade them and steal this idea? That's his idea for this movie. And he goes to France to look at their school lunch program, which is just this heartwarming ideal of the way school lunches should be set up, with chefs serving the meals at round tables where kids are sitting. It's edible food. It's not repackaged and delivered from some central kitchen. And it's not subsidizing USDA farmers, which is how we organize in this country. I don't know, what else should I say? The Costa Rica bus collection I thought was fascinating. So somebody in Costa Rica went onto a bus to collect cash to meet somebody's medical needs. And one of the techniques they used for collecting was to show the medical records of this person because it demonstrated the authenticity of the case. I found that just heartbreaking in some way, but I don't know, GoFundMe doesn't seem to require that sort of accountability or verification of need. It's sort of really weird, right? There's a program in Seattle called Samaritan. Does anybody know that? I should have mentioned this earlier when I was talking about sort of GoFundMe adjacent things. But this is this very bizarre program where homeless people can register with this organization that in some ways, I believe, vets them for their authenticity, deservingness. I love the way Nora deals with the deservingness issue. And you as a middle-class person can sign up with this app, the Samaritan app, so that when you're wandering around downtown, your phone can alert you when you're close to somebody who carries a Samaritan medallion, a homeless person. And then you could see this person and punch them a few dollars, right? Kind of like the here's a few bucks, sorry for racism thing in your book. Just the creepiest thing ever, right? This is how we deal with how to subsidize the needs of homeless people. Jesus. Maybe I'll stop there.
You go for it. Great. Yeah, so I also loved this book. I thought it was super easy read if anyone, I bought an extra copy if anyone wants one. As one of these prizes, yes. Anyway, so I also love the poems. Wanted to say that was such a nice creative touch, and I was curious how you came up with that, because that was, I thought, a nice touch to the book. But I think sort of for me, what this really brought up and really intersected with some of my work on sort of who is deserving and what do we deserve as, you know, individuals living in our nation. What do we deserve from our country, from our country's government specifically? And this sort of came up again and again, I thought, in many of the stories. So around this question of deservingness, you know, this is central, and I know here we are in the policy school, many of you have thought about this way more than I have, so I'd love to hear your thoughts too, but, you know, so many of our social programs do things like work requirements, right? Work requirements for TANF, work requirements for SNAP. Some people are trying work requirements for Medicaid, which is crazy to me. But these requirements really are barriers essentially to the goals of the program. And it seems like you're structuring a program so it's setting itself up to fail, right? And there was really some parallels here. Like the structure of GoFundMe and crowdsourcing in general is like, there's never a success, right? Really. I mean, there was like maybe one, but you know, it seems like we need to think a little bit about sort of how we structure these things, right, more broadly. But thinking about deservingness too, another sort of place where this connected for me was this idea of inheritance, right? So inheritance is very much unearned. And there was this great book years ago by Oliver Shapiro looking at wealth. And they were talking to people about inheritances, and people are like, no, I deserve that money, right? That is mine. But what have you done to earn it, right? And so this idea of deserving is sort of, I felt like fit in with this idea of, you know, thinking about who earns things and who deserves things. And anyway, sort of rambling now. And then the other piece on deservingness I thought was interesting was that some people in their campaigns, they sort of hide the truth a little bit because the truth makes them seem less deserving. And that was very just jarring and uncomfortable for me because it's like, I mean, they weren't lying outright, but they were massaging. Yes. That was quite troubling. And then getting around to these ideas around what we deserve from our government. So this really, we recently did some qualitative work with food workers during the pandemic, who are all essential workers. And we were trying to explore this exact question. So, you know, what is it that you expect your government to do? And we got these very vastly different sort of responses depending on where people were based. And it seemed like the conclusion was, what people expect is really based on their experience. So food workers here in Washington State, they were getting things like hazard pay. They were getting things like, rent, eviction, sort of time to pay their back rent or whatever it was. Whereas in other states, there was none of those types of programs. And so people in the other place we interviewed was in Indiana, were saying, oh, I don't expect anything. Right? I don't really deserve anything and I don't expect anything. I'm just happy to have this job. Right. And it was quite a contrast. So I just am really interested in thinking about how do we sort of change our mindset to really expect more, because I think we all deserve more, right, from government programs. And then just a few notes on sort of disciplinary self-critique, which is sort of a tenet of critical race theory. So I think public health has some responsibility in a lot of this, right? We have for decades sort of had so much judgment and stigma around unhealthy behaviors. Yeah. And that continues to this day. I mean, now, of course, all the research is shifting to think, well, what are the structural factors that drive unhealthy behaviors? But, if you look at the media, that doesn't really come up anywhere. And people have really internalized these ideas of, it is my fault, I am sick. I make these choices, it is my health, right? And I find that to be troubling and something that we need to do more in public health. And then lastly, these ideas of, we just need to educate people about their health, right? And I mean, for decades, there were health education departments in schools of public health, right? It is not at all about education. And you had a great piece in there where people knew exactly what they needed to do to maintain and control their diabetes. They just didn't have the resources to do it. So, what are we doing in public health to make sure that we are not sending these messages, that it's really so simple, right, to fix? Another really interesting point, I thought it was very interesting to see that the gender roles really continue in this space. This is considered like women's work. And I was very curious to hear your thoughts on why do we think that is? Is it really just this caretaking role, or are there other attributes that make it women's work, right? And then a few just other random thoughts, and I will stop. Amy sort of touched on this, but I was very troubled by the one campaign that they earned well above their amount that they asked for, and then they used that money to start a business. Yeah. I mean, this is morally very problematic. And I wanted to get your, how does that happen? Is that a common thing? Is this, it was just very troubling to me that people would, you're giving money for a healthcare concern, and then it is being used for completely another sort of thing. And it seems not kosher at all. And then it really also made me think about the nature of care, right? So, there's this trade-off presented. Either you do monetary care or you do sort of this idea of caregiving, right? And I think, I was thinking back in times in my life when I've needed care, and maybe this is my privilege, but it's very special to have somebody come and cook for you or to take care of you in some way when you need that, right? Which is so different from this idea of monetary care. Of course, we need both, and I know I'm privileged enough to maybe not have always needed that monetary care, but it was presented as a trade-off in the book, and I thought that was really interesting as well. So, and then two questions I wanted to leave you with is, one is, I was a little surprised towards the end when you were talking about repair and remaking. My original thought was, you're going to talk forcefully about policy change and what we need to do, but you didn't. And so I wanted to get your thoughts on why not really focus more on, we've stopped talking about single payer, government-sponsored healthcare. Well, why have we stopped talking about this? Obamacare is here, but it didn't fix the problems, right? So just to get your thoughts on what we should be doing around the policy side. And then another thing I really appreciated, and something that keeps coming up for me these days, is how do we go about imagining a different future? And you talk about this a lot. I find this really difficult because it's sort of like, it's sort of like racism and white supremacy culture, right? You can't see outside the water you swim in. So how do you think about that and really trying to think about a world that is worth living, borrowing from a student. Anyway, I thought it was fabulous. Thank you so much for writing the book, but I'll stop babbling.
Thank you both so much. This is so many wonderful things, and I think in many places you've said things better than I was able to say them in the book. I'm going to try and make some connections and then maybe pick up some threads that you seemed particularly interested in. So both of you talked about this sort of tendency in public health and sometimes social policy more broadly to assume that we can kind of educate people out of their problems, right? And I think I've also seen a shift as more people in public health and social sciences have started to really seriously consider the social determinants of health and what we do with them, towards kind of moving slightly towards a structural intervention, but then the structural intervention actually still looks like behavior change. So to give one example, and I think this is actually an interesting intervention and one that has some promise, but and one that folks that I really respect here at UW have been working on, but it's the idea that low-income patients can be given some financial education that would then help them to pay off their medical bills. And the experiments done on financial education do show pretty powerful health improvement. However, I wonder why there isn't a parallel set of efforts being made to educate, for example, hospitals on how they should be paying back the charity care that they owe to patients, right? And this is something that some of Amy's students have worked on. So there's an organization called $4 that actually works with patients to try and help them to access the charity care that they are actually entitled to from hospitals. And they estimate that every year patients are billed $14 billion for care that they should not have to pay for, right? So for me, the question is like, why are we doing education on one end of this, but not at the top end? And so I think some of the sort of GoFundMe adjacent, as Amy is putting it, efforts that are being mentioned here, I think what makes them profoundly different is that they're doing some of that work at the top end as well. So if you look, for example, I think abortion funds are a really great example of this. A lot of people just give money to abortion funds and know that it's going to support someone somewhere and accessing an abortion that they would not otherwise be able to access. But those funds are some of the most important kind of community organizing and sort of grassroots mobilization groups as well around the US that are trying to work to protect abortion at these upper levels. Similarly, I think organizations like the Debt Collective, I don't know if anyone knows the Debt Collective, they are a debtors union. And they work with debtors to organize them and to help debtors recognize the power that they have as debtors and as a block of debtors in the United States. And they work specifically around both medical debt and student debt. Their platform is that debtors have power, that there's power in both defaulting on debts, but also there's power in pointing out the injustice of debts in the first place. And so I see work like theirs as kind of swimming a bit more upstream than some of these other interventions. Another sort of thing that I think was coming out in a couple of the comments was the recognition that these ways of thinking, that crowdfunding incentivizes and normalizes us to, are increasingly becoming embedded within our institutional systems of care, right? And so we can see that in a lot of different ways, in the ways that hospital systems now sort of rely on patients crowdfunding in order to pay off some of their bills. But also, I give an example in the book of the fact that when the US State Department was having trouble getting aid to Ukraine early in the Russian-Ukraine conflict, their partner, they created a formal partnership with GoFundMe and with some celebrities to route funds to Ukraine. Similarly, I was just talking to a journalist this week about some of the responses to hurricanes in the US and the role that GoFundMe has played in those responses. And this journalist was telling me that he had just been speaking to the CEO of GoFundMe, who had told him that, you know, when they're doing these immediate response planning sort of roundtables, that oftentimes GoFundMe is invited to sit at the table with FEMA and these other organizations in sort of planning what the humanitarian response is going to look like in those places. So I think it's important for us to recognize how much it's sort of being cemented into these systems. And and becoming a sort of default part of the care infrastructure. So that I find very troubling. Okay, Amy mentioned sort of philanthrocapitalism, the idea that philanthropy is a way of making money and protecting capital. It's really important to mention that GoFundMe is a for-profit company and it's privately traded, so no one knows anything about its finances and there's zero transparency there. But I think more broadly, there are so many companies that are sort of profiting off of both the insecurities created by the US healthcare system, but also by the sort of increasing financialization of the US healthcare system. That is the idea that we are increasingly sort of creating value out of indebtedness and out of financial insecurity within that system. And so GoFundMe is very much part of that. And then, okay, so the nature of care was also something that I think both of you brought up on a more personal basis. And this was really something I was very interested in, was sort of like, how are tech platforms more generally changing the nature of care, the ways that we offer care to each other? So I do offer this example in the book from this incredible episode of Radiolab, which explored the phenomenon of white people giving small amounts of money via Venmo and other cash transfer apps to Black friends in 2020. And what that represents about the way that we sort of think about what we owe each other and how we care for each other. And I think that's an extreme example, but I think it helps us to understand a little bit of what is happening in certain crowdfunding campaigns. At the same time, I think it's important to say that there are a lot of crowdfunders who feel lots of feelings about their campaigns and feel very supported emotionally through their campaigns. And so there's an important aspect of crowdfunding that relates to other forms of sort of what we might think of as like tech-enabled biosociality that's happening by and through platforms in connecting patients to broader social networks of support. So there are intangible forms of support that are facilitated through platforms like GoFundMe that I think are very powerful and very helpful to patients, even when a campaign is not necessarily financially successful. As Anjum pointed out, a lot of the care for the campaign is being done by women. So in one of our studies, we looked at like, okay, well, if you take the proportion of campaigns that are started on behalf of someone else, so typically when someone is so sick they can't start a campaign for themselves, well, it turned out that more than 80% of those campaigns had been started and maintained by women. And this is probably reflective of broader patterns of gendered labor within not just traditional care economies, but also the digital creator economies, right? So there's been excellent work done on sort of how feminized a lot of labor is in digital creator and sort of like Instagram, Etsy type economies. And then I think there were a couple comments around sort of like what GoFundMe depoliticizes. And I really appreciated Amy's point about how it's sort of, it's only personal drama. It's not a political drama. And I have a paper that I should have written many years ago on sort of how people talk about Obamacare in different crowdfunding campaigns. But I do think that there's a way in which GoFundMe is a very powerful distraction from the kinds of work that we need to be doing. And also, a lot of the people that I was talking to that were crowdfunding were intimately aware of the ways that the healthcare system was harming them and very supportive across political boundaries of healthcare reform. And so while I think I start out the book really pointing out how the current healthcare system that we have and the failed efforts to reform it have very much created this economy, I really wanted to focus in the book on the sort of moral frameworks and mindsets that get normalized by GoFundMe and that then inhibit our ability to kind of build the social power necessary to do the more political reform work. Because I think one of the things that's important to recognize is so much of the opposition to healthcare reform and welfare reform and all kinds of things in the US has really come from very entrenched and racialized and gendered norms of not actually wanting to essentially share fate with people who don't look like ourselves and not wanting to share resources with quote unquote the other. And to the extent that crowdfunding further individualizes and sort of reifies that notion of like, I get to choose who I support and who I give my assistance to, I think that it really powerfully sort of reasserts those really central kind of, unfortunately, very American, white American, especially values that have really undermined a lot of the policy and political work that we've tried to do around reform. So I think we know, a lot of us know what more just health systems would look like. But I think we don't quite know how to build the social kind of support for those. And that to me is the real challenge, particularly in the light of like COVID and realizing that like a very broad swath of Americans are perfectly willing to put each other at risk, right? With very little sense of sort of shared solidarity. And so I think we gotta figure out some ways to socially tackle that in order to make the political work more successful. Let me stop there. Okay, thanks. Yeah.
Thank you for this really fascinating. It brings out so many things about especially like having commemoration of but it was making me think as we were talking so much about mutual aid approaches to a lot of these issues about tensions and the uses of mutual aid, living in the real life, whether or not using these approaches, undermines the tools and possibilities in general to public approaches to solve the problem.
Yeah.
And after this, we're going to be thinking here. I was thinking about abolition, because you were talking about that. And Jay-Z's like co-optation.
Yeah.
Thomas tracks money to. And I guess many people would see crowdfunding as kind of a mutual aid approach. So where do we find that? I guess.
Yeah, so I think it's important to say that lots of mutual aid networks have relied on platforms like GoFundMe to do some essential fundraising. One of the things I try and get to in the book is sort of parsing out using GoFundMe as a tool versus adopting all of its sort of ways of thinking. And so I have some examples of how mutual aid organizers have used it in very different ways than it's intended to be used, and used it quite successfully. So what we know from a lot of science and technology scholars is that like platforms don't always control the ways that they're used, right? And so we have lots of examples of people using, for example, you know, TikTok for abolition, right? And so there are ways to work around those limitations and affordances, sort of embedded affordances of those platforms. But I do think that there is a broader tension within mutual aid and I would say more broadly kind of organizing communities between the work of the immediate and the work of the long term, right? And how do we bring those things closer together when, I mean, especially in the last 4 years, it's just been a constant state of polycrisis. And people are exhausted and networks are exhausted. I think where I draw some hope and sort of optimism, if you will, is that a lot of the networks that were born out of the immediate first days of COVID or even before then have survived and they've thrived and they've continued doing the work and they've found ways to make their network sustainable. And so I have some I think interesting and telling examples, some from a project that Amy and I actually did with a graduate student interviewing mutual aid networks who are responding to COVID. but how these networks think about the long-term work. And part of what they're really powerful at doing, I think, is helping people who need assistance to reframe why they need it and to start moving away from that sort of politics of shame that's so embedded within the American system. And so I think that might be a place where mutual aid is really powerful and effective, regardless of whether it's using crowdfunding as a platform or not. Yeah.
Thank you. And I'm not ready yet, so maybe these questions kind of obvious. But could you talk a little bit more about the themes of deservingness, or
Yeah.
sort of what language we're using, kind of in tandem with that? I was really interested in this verification subject matter.
Oh yeah.
As an example, if people were, it's already one thing to bury their illness to the world or to apply it for also revealing other parts of their lives that made them feel or seem more deserving for it.
Yeah, so I think there is sort of mostly silent or implicit sort of moral economy of crowdfunding that has a very kind of specific hierarchy of deservingness in terms of what you're supposed to crowdfund for, and who is expected to be successful in that regard. So even if you go to like the how-to pages of GoFundMe, they'll talk a lot about, you know, the importance of telling your story in a really genuine way and making sure that you point out like all the good things about yourself. And, you know, and so you can very easily start to see patterns as you start to look through campaigns of people, you know, affirming things like hardworking or like being a loving parent, right? Or, you know, one of the most common things is just like good people, you know, like there's this constant refrain of like, so-and-so is a really good person. And so it's time for us to show up for them. And that can seem really innocuous to us, but it really profoundly undermines a more universalist notion of people simply deserving care because they need it, right? Not necessarily based on any personal characteristics. And so one of the interesting moves that GoFundMe has made as a company is they've basically said, like, there's too much, like, there's so much going on. They cannot police everything, right? But they do know that they have a problem with fraud, and they definitely have a problem with perceptions of fraud. And so what they've said is we rely on our community to identify when like fishy things are happening, right? So they basically rely on reporting from people who are part of campaigns to sort of say when things are not what the people say they are. That sure opens the door to a lot of bias, right? And a lot of, so people who are creating campaigns now are very aware of that. They're often trying to like be really careful about how they document and speak about what's going on. But also people who are looking at campaigns as donors are also looking at them with a very critical viewpoint. So one of the things that came forward in focus groups that I did with donors was donors would look at, for example, a campaign that hadn't raised any money, and they'd say, well, no one has vouched for this person. And one person even compared it to like not having any Amazon reviews, sort of, right? And they would also look at things like spelling errors and sort of say, well, I understand why this might have spelling errors, but it still looks to me like really suspicious, right? So I think we've sort of almost like outsourced a lot of this like very gut-based assessment of like what's legit or deserving in very, very problematic ways to a very anonymous crowd. And to get back to one of Amy's points about why crowdfunding for people who are trying to get out of Gaza right now is not working is actually because a lot of those campaigns face relentless reporting of being fraudulent by people who are not supporting the Palestinian cause. So you definitely have these like challenging crowd dynamics that are happening there. I think there was a hand back here first, and then.
I was also thinking about this deserving communities and just thinking about, you know, the way we find out about those things is through social media. That is how they use around. But then a lot of the embedded and talking about it, social fabric
seeing a post on social media, it's sort of a news story about the kid who got a lot of money.
Yep.
Right, and then you also will see people on Facebook or on the news even talking about, oh, so-and-so crowdfunded for this community now. Right, like this kind of, and so I'm really curious about the role of media and how it might be sort of solidifying these things that we've come to accept about it, whereas it would seem to me, from our personal experience, being shared at a level level, that should be embedding or teaching us cultural things about the good or bad or the morality around creating, but all of the perception is really around the receipt.
Yes. Yeah, or like the morality of asking, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, or needing. Yeah, 100%. And traditional media, in particular local news, has played an enormous role in the rise of GoFundMe and the spread of these kinds of stories. So it's one of the key contributors to campaign success if you can actually get your, campaign on local news. Early on in its existence, GoFundMe actually had a huge corporate partnership with the San Diego Tribune, where like literally every time the San Diego Tribune wrote a story about anyone in difficult circumstances, GoFundMe would set up a campaign for them, and like the Tribune would link to the campaign. And even now, if you look at the way news covers these things, it often very uncritically sort of endorses and links to campaigns. So I think that news has the news cycle, right? And also like how news has been changed by social media infrastructures where we're looking for very spreadable stories. All of that has really shaped the success of GoFundMe as this like form of like narrative media as well.
Yeah.
My name's Heather, and faculty here at the school. Thank you all three of you for your presentations and interesting discussion. Really interesting work. Shout out for the Evans School for any students in the room. If you're interested in taking classes on how policymakers make decisions, how philanthropists or private policymakers, how we construct terms like deservingness, we teach classes on all those things here. I am curious about digging in a little deeper on the policy context for why this is happening. And I had two thoughts that came to my mind about how I might go about doing that. I was wondering if you or anyone else thought of doing that. So one is that you could do comparative work with other countries. The change in the digital world is happening worldwide. The health crises are often happening worldwide, but we have a very unique set of social policies and healthcare policies. Could you sort of unpack what parts of those are really leading to this kind of phenomenon by other countries? And then the other thought I had is looking at specifically the demographics and context of the people who are in the GoFundMe space asking for money. And does that tell us anything about, does it match up with what we know the gaps are in our system?
Yeah, great questions. And there has been some good research on this, and there's room for like way more. So to just very briefly answer the question, because I'm looking at the clock, what GoFundMe is used for does vary country to country, and does seem to reflect persistent gaps within those country care systems. It's not like crowdfunding doesn't exist in other countries, but oftentimes it can be used for different ends. Even if it's used for health, it can be sometimes more geared towards experimental treatments or treatments that have very long wait lists within the public system. But as we've seen neoliberalism really erode public healthcare systems in places like the UK, we've seen this like pretty astronomical rise in crowdfunding. So I'm actually going to be in London in a couple weeks for a conference on sort of how charity is overtaking the NHS. So this is very much something they're thinking about. And then some research I did with Mark Igra, who's a sociology student here, but also research that other folks have done has shown things like there is more crowdfunding for more health concerns in places that did not take Medicaid expansion under the Affordable Care Act, where people are more underinsured, where they carry more medical debt. What I think is even more interesting as a story is that those are the places where crowdfunding is also less successful. So it's hard to say if that's a saturation issue or if it's people are so beleaguered by the cash costs of all those different gaps in those systems that they have less to give and less to contribute to each other. But I think definitely crowdfunding reflects both the gaps in the system, but also the depletion and exhaustion of our own care networks within those systems. Thank you.
Graduates, you're welcome to join some more and this for
I